Today's episode of the Lutheran Cartographer is brought to you by Audible. Get a free trial offer with a free audiobook at audibletrial.com/Lutheran Cartographer. The Lutheran Cartographer, Episode 25. Welcome to the Lutheran Cartographer, the podcast where we explore what it's like to be Lutheran in different places. Today we are joined by Pastor Ryan Tinetti of Trinity Lutheran Church in Arcadia, Michigan. Pastor Tinetti, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell our listeners, where exactly are we in Michigan? Where is Arcadia?
Right. So if they can all pull out their hands, as Michiganders are prone to do, right? And you look at your right hand, that gives you roughly an idea of what Michigan looks like. Not to slight our Upper Peninsula friends; they often get left out when we do the hand map for Michigan. But if you're doing that, Arcadia is up near the top of your pinky, depending on the size of your fingers. But it's about 3/4 of the way up the West Michigan coastline, right on Lake Michigan.
Okay, so this is with our palms up and with our thumbs pointed to the right.
Yes, that's right. Yep. You can kind of picture a map, and we're on the left side there. Yep.
Okay, good deal. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you ended up on the pinky of Michigan.
So I was born and raised down on the other side of Michigan, southeastern Michigan, in the Detroit area, and so I'm a native Michigander, and grew up in the state, and went to undergrad in Michigan as well. But since graduating from college, I've really bounced around all over the place. I spent a year overseas in Bangkok, Thailand, as a missionary with LCMS World Mission. Went to seminary in St. Louis. My vicarage was in Tucson. And then I've served two parishes prior to this one in coastal California on the Monterey Peninsula, and another one in Washington State, in your state on the other side there in Spokane. And so I've really been fortunate to be able to serve in some beautiful places and to be exposed to a lot of wonderful areas. And for me and for my family, I'm married and we've got 4 kids. What I have always had a deep longing for is roots, and for a connection to a community, especially a community of faith, but as well to be part of to be part of a real place. And in Arcadia, I first came across it, and we can talk more about how we happened upon this small little town. But when I first visited here, it just gave me this deep sense of rootedness that I found immediately appealing. And I'm not the only one, as many other folks who have made their way to Arcadia, either to live or to visit, could attest as well. And so having come here, having visited and receiving the call here, it was just a natural fit for myself and for my family, and it's been a real blessing being here.
That is a wonderful thing to feel that sense of connection.
Yeah.
So tell our listeners a little bit more about how that rootedness here in Arcadia contrasts with some of the other places you've been. I mean, clearly people feel a sense of community in lots of different places. What makes Arcadia different than some of the other places that you've been?
Sure. Well, first I would say is that all the places that we've been have been really wonderful. I've been very fortunate. I joke with folks, call day. We just had the call days at the seminaries, and you'll hear a lot of guys are being called to, Wrath of God Lutheran Church in Zap, North Dakota, something like this. And so my first calls to Faith Lutheran Church in Seaside, California. And everybody just looked at me like, who did you have to pay to get that? We've lived in some really wonderful places in the desert, on the ocean, near the mountains. But just take that example of California and the Monterey area, which is a beautiful, wonderful area. A lot of the population is very transient, though. You have the large military presence there, the Naval Postgraduate School, and also the Defense Language Institute. A lot of military folks. Many of our congregational members were military. And so they'll be passing through. There's universities as well. And that's great. That's wonderful. It's an opportunity for ministry. But in terms of roots, it wasn't quite able to develop that same sense of rootedness, apart from the fact that the cost of living is just exceptionally high there.
Yeah.
in Washington State, our experience in Spokane was different. It was more a place where you had a lot of folks who lived there, who were from there, and you got a sense that it was a genuine community. But it was like all the other places I'd lived, a bigger city, depending on what your frame of reference is. But Spokane's about 250,000 people. Again, I grew up in the Detroit area, which in that whole metro area is 4 or 5 million people. I'd only ever lived in cities, or at least large suburbs. And now what really the big contrast is Arcadia it's a small rural hamlet, really. Our year-round population is about 700. In the summertime, at least most summers, it goes up to probably 3,000. But even then, this is a small town, and it's off the beaten path in a lot of ways. And so it's been a transition, but it's definitely a big contrast from everywhere else I've lived to be now rural and to be in the country. Obviously, there's a lot of folks, they grew up that way. They don't know anything different. For me, it's quite different. And there's a lot about that I'm really enjoying, that my family's enjoying as well.
That is fantastic. So you mentioned earlier that there was a story behind how you found out about Arcadia. Tell us that story.
So Arcadia, for those who don't know, is most closely associated with Camp Arcadia. So Camp Arcadia is here. It's going to be celebrating its 100th anniversary in a couple of years. And it's a Lutheran family camp. It's really like a resort camp in a lot of ways. It's not like a lot of other Lutheran camps where it's just for kids and summer camp. Instead, it's different in that, A, it invites whole families to come for a week, and B, each week has speakers who come. They call them deans and lecturers. It might be seminary professors, pastors, authors, from throughout, not only Lutherans, but also throughout other Christian denominations as well, are invited to come and speak. And so it really gives it this sense of a place of Christian formation and education, as well as vacationing with God, which is kind of their tagline. So I got invited to be one of these deans or lecturers, I can't recall which. About 5 years ago, I got to know the camp director, Chip May, and invited me to come out. So we're coming out. This is in 2016, and as we're planning to have this visit up here, my wife, who grew up in Denver, is from Colorado. She hears from her dad. She says, "So you guys are going to Arcadia?" She says, "Yeah." And he says, "We've got kin from Arcadia." And my wife, Ann, she's like, "Really? A, Michigan," because she'd never lived in Michigan, and B, this small little town up on the pinky of Michigan. How could that be? Well, come to find out that my wife's great, great, great grandfather, 3 greats, for those of you scoring at home, was a guy by the name of Henry Starkey. And he came over from Milwaukee. Well, he initially came over from the old country, right, from Germany, landed in Milwaukee, and was part of Trinity Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, that one that had burned, the beautiful old church that had burned a couple of years ago. And in his retirement, he decided he wanted to start a town. Okay, so he goes across the lake. He had made some trips over to northern Michigan, and he had bought this vast swath of land that he thought we could put in a lumber mill here, maybe a furniture factory. And he does that. And in his retirement, he starts this little village. But he tells his pastor back in Milwaukee, "Hey, look, if I'm not able to help form a Lutheran congregation within the first couple of years, I'm going to come back." Okay, so he does it. He along with several other laymen, they helped to start a church plant, call a pastor. Of course, they started a school right away as well in the good old Lutheran tradition. And this is in 1880s. Okay. Well, this Henry Starkey, as I say, is the great grandfather of my wife Ann, and his son Charles had given the land for Camp Arcadia. And when we were first coming up here, Ann's dad tells her about this connection, and so we look into it and find out about it. We're just absolutely floored about this. Ann had no idea, and she tracks back through the family records, and sure enough, there was the Starkey family. And long story short, the lumber industry kind of petered out. Similar things have happened up in Washington State as well, and the family relocated to the Denver area. and kind of continued from there. And so here we are. We make this visit up to Arcadia, and not only does the community itself already have this sense of being this thick, community with strong bonds, but now suddenly we find out we have these unique family roots as well. And I was just really taken by that. I'm kind of a romantic at heart, and I just thought, wow, that's really fantastic. Then when we get the call here a few years later, it was difficult to turn down, to think about, my kids being able to grow up in a town where they have such deep roots. So it's been really tremendous in that respect.
Yes, and that sounds like a retirement project that all of us can aspire to, going and starting a town.
Right, for sure.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the great things about Arcadia. You already mentioned the sense of rootedness, a great place for your family. What are some of the other great things about being there?
Well, I tell people, a lot of folks ask, so because of the camp here, Camp Arcadia, you've got thousands of folks who are coming up here every summer. And summertime in northern Michigan generally is just wonderful. And then to come to Camp Arcadia, and here it's this, this profound sense of community, and faith is at the center, and it's just beautiful. You're on Lake Michigan. And so people ask me all the time, what's it like to live here, right? And my simple answer that I give to people is that it's a real place. Because for a lot of folks, they think of Arcadia as like this utopia. I mean, it's Arcadia, going back to the Greeks, Arcadia was kind of this vision of the rural paradise. Virgil invokes it, and so forth. And people can still have in their minds, okay, Arcadia, Michigan, is this kind of utopia. And it's wonderful for reasons I'm going to lay out for you. But I tell folks it's a real place. It's not a utopia, literally a no place. It's a real place. And I mean that in both senses. So on the one hand, it's a real place. It has real sinners. It has real problems. Poverty is an issue. All the things you've heard about with rural communities across the country is true here as well. Underemployment. A friend of mine pointed out that up in northern Michigan, she said nobody does just one thing. And what she meant by that is a lot of people are wearing two hats. So maybe in the wintertime, they plow roads. And in the summertime, they work at the golf course or whatever it might be. They do what they have to do because they want to be here. And so there's real challenges up here. And you can't just idealize it. Every place is going to have its issues, and Arcadia is no exception from that. But it's a real place. And it's that sense of placeness that I find so wonderful. In our country right now, there's just kind of this flattening where you can go, you might not know whether you're in Tacoma or Dallas or, any number of other places, because there's the same strip malls, there's the same kind of things. And at least in Washington, you can look up and, oh, there's Mount Rainier. Like there's those things that orient you. But in so many places, it's been flattened out and made to be just so bland and uniformly ugly in a lot of ways. But with Arcadia, as well as with a lot of rural communities, they still have that distinctive sense of town pride and identity. For us, a lot of it is shaped by, of course, our spot in creation, our geographical location, but also just that sense of, as you say, of the community, the people caring for one another, caring about their place. And that to me is deeply appealing and one of the things that I really enjoy about Arcadia.
So that sense of place and the sense of uniqueness, then, that this isn't just any other corporate America blah sort of place. It's its own place.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, to go further with that, especially for us as Lutherans. Now, of course, not everybody will resonate with this to the same degree. If you're not a Christian, certainly if you're not a Lutheran, that you wouldn't appreciate this so much. But in Arcadia, you have in some ways kind of like a village where it's Lutheranism. The other example of this from Michigan would be Frankenmuth, of course, where it really was established as like this Lutheran Mecca, to kind of paradoxically put it that way. But where in Arcadia, that Lutheran identity and the faith is really woven into it. So my undergrad was in sociology, and I remember we had a sociology, urban sociology kind of class, and I remember my professor saying, you can tell a lot about a town by what is its tallest building. Okay, what's the structure that is the tallest there. And he gave the example in East Lansing, the tallest building was Hubbard Hall, and it was a dormitory, and spoke to the town's identity as a university town. You go to Chicago, it's going to be Sears Tower. Is it still called the Sears Tower? The tall building, and showing commercial finance, etc. And you can do this in a lot of places. It's a heuristic. It's not always the case, but in Arcadia, the tallest structure and the tallest point is the church steeple. And even if you're to go up, we have a spot just north of town we call the Arcadia Overlook or Inspiration Point, and it's just this fantastic view on Lake Michigan. It's a few hundred feet above the town. You look down on the town of Arcadia, and all you see are trees, the tops of trees, and then you see this church steeple coming up out of it. And it's just this remarkable view. But to me, it harkens back to an older view of town life where the church is at the center. And Henry Starkey platted it so that the Trinity Lutheran Church is literally at the center of the geographical center of town. And we have our church bells, and that created a controversy recently. I can share more of that if you're interested. But those church bells that continue to call all people, whether or not they happen to believe, to a deeper sense of the transcendent, that God is present here. And that, to me, really marks it out, that sense of the faith interwoven with the community, with the church at the center, and then spreading out to all of our neighbors so that we're a blessing even to those who are not only not Lutheran, but not Christian, really makes it distinctive.
Yeah. Okay, so you've touched on earlier some of the challenges about being there. You briefly mentioned the poverty and the underemployment. Would you speak a little bit more about some of the challenges about being in Arcadia?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, of course, you talk to anybody from Northern Michigan, the first thing they're going to say is the winter, right? And my friend, Pastor Josh Lefevre, he mentioned this as well in your interview with him. But I don't think that's quite right. I mean, if you're somebody who just does not like the snow, does not like winter, for sure, Northern Michigan, a lot of the Northern United States, is not for you. And I lived in Tucson, and I met those people who just so did not want snow that they were willing to put up with 110 degrees in it. You know what I mean? But winter itself, to me, is really beautiful, and especially in what called the dead of winter, in December, January, February, when you're regularly getting snowfall, and we average about 120 inches a year, about 10 feet of snow a year. It's really beautiful. I mean, even growing up downstate Michigan, you'd get to a point in January or certainly February where you're not getting a lot of snow, and you just kind of get that gray stuff that's hanging around until March or April, and it's just ugly. And here we just are continually getting these regular snowfalls. And if you kind of embrace winter sports and getting outside in the wintertime, it's really can be quite wonderful. Your question, though, was what are the challenges? And so the dead of winter isn't the problem. The problem is more the shoulder seasons. This is one of the challenges, is that it's not winter itself. It's what we call late winter, okay, where, March and even into April, where it's still cold, and you're like, what do I got to do to get some warmer weather around here? Those are the tougher times. The other things, challenges, I mean, this can kind of cut both ways. You don't have the shopping and the entertainment options around here that you would in other places. And I think that this can cut both ways for sure. I was at my barber, I've got a barber, your town barber guy. And we were having a conversation. This was pre-COVID, obviously. We were having a conversation about life up here, and he was also a transplant. And I said, a lot of people talk about it, that life is simpler up here. And I said, well, what do you think people mean by that? And he had a great answer to that. He said, it means fewer options. And depending on your perspective, that can be a good or a bad thing. For some folks, that can be really frustrating. Like, there's just the one grocery store. There's just the one movie theater. And in fact, our closest movie theater just shows one movie at a time. There's fewer options. That leads to a deeper sense of simplicity. To me, it's less stress because, what Michael Pollan called the omnivore's dilemma. We can have anything, everything, all the time in our modern society. I think I find it helpful to be able to limit those options sometimes, but for other folks, that can be a real challenge. So, and you got to travel an hour if you want to go to a shopping mall. And I've done that once since I've lived here. Things like, although sometimes I'm a little bit of a Luddite and I resist technology, Amazon can still get things here in a couple of days. I can order stuff from REI online and it's going to get here shortly. And so I think in some ways our technology and the internet has facilitated moves like my family has made more easily because you have access to those things, which even 20 years ago you might not have.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's take a moment for a word from our sponsor. If you've got a lot of downtime right now, there's no better time to start a new audiobook. And you can do that with Audible, the sponsors of today's show. Their free 30-day trial comes with a free audiobook that you get to keep. Check that trial out at audibletrial.com/Lutheran Cartographer. Let's get back to our guest. So tell us a little bit about what it's like to be Lutheran in this place that was very intentionally planted to be Lutheran and has this Lutheran retreat center. What's it like?
Yeah, so it really is, as I say, it's distinctive in that the faith really is part of that history of it, and it's still part of the everyday presence of it. So within Arcadia, first let's talk about the church. So we're basically the only show in town. Right. There's a Methodist church, but they have about 6 or 7 folks, and they only meet for part of the year. So it's interesting for people just talk about Trinity Church. That it's a Lutheran church. If you're not part of our community, is neither here nor there. It's just the church in Arcadia, or the Arcadia Church, and I think that gives a unique kind of air and sense to the area and then I'm kind of regarded as just the town pastor. And something I really enjoy is that I'm able to minister to folks who may never darken the door on Sunday, right? But who still call when they're in need or just want somebody to talk to. I had a conversation with our town doctor last night because he just needed to, unburden himself a little bit. And so that's kind of unique in its own way. But then you can't have that conversation about what does it mean to be Lutheran in Arcadia without talking about Camp Arcadia. Because for 5 months out of the year, you've got this regular stream of visitors coming from all over the country. Not all Lutheran, but the vast majority of them. And you have just this rich worship life of, we're having Vespers several nights a week. We're doing Taizé services. So you've got things happening during the week in addition to our normal just kind of parish worship life. Mentioned before, you've got these lectures and Bible studies, and just that sense of people who are bound together by a common faith. And even when we're just enjoying things, sitting on the beach, eating together, that kind of thing, there's just this deeper sense of a sense of belonging, right? That you're part of something bigger, that you're part of your Lutheran tradition, that you're part of the Church Catholic, that you're part of this body of believers that transcends time and space, but which in a particularly focused way meets here in this place in Arcadia. And so, especially the summers are just remarkable and really just especially to be a Lutheran Christian, I think there's few better places to be.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the camp and how the relationship between the church and the camp works.
Yeah, so it's mostly kind of an informal relationship, although, as I say, the church, in a sense, seeded the camp. So Walter A. Meyer, the famous Lutheran Hour speaker, and is connected with the Walther League, he had visited up here with some others, and he had this vision of starting a youth camp, a Lutheran camp that was especially going to be for raising up young leaders. And he had visited up here. I can't recall what brought him into the area, but Charles Starkey, the son of Henry Starkey, took him on a tour, showed him around, and said, we're willing to donate, I think it was like 50 acres of Lake Michigan coastland, right? I mean, in dollars, you can only imagine what that would be worth. Because Charles Starkey wanted to see Walter A. Meyer's vision come about. And so the church and members of the church had a hand in helping to start the camp. Since then, the camp has really, blossomed and grown so much over the last century. But there continues to be this continuity and connection. So, for instance, in the summertime, one of the deans or the lecturers for the week will often preach at Trinity. And I'll serve as liturgist and celebrate the sacrament and so forth. But we'll have them preach, which is great. I mean, I get to hear some of the best preachers in our denomination coming through, and it's really a fantastic thing. And then, of course, you've got folks who are members of the church are going to visit the camp. There's also what's called a cottage colony. So it started up not long after the camp started, where people were like, hey, I really like it here. I'd like to be able to be here more often. And so they started this cottage colony of, I don't know, maybe 100 homes. Most of them are seasonal, but probably a fifth of them are year-round people who live there. And so they're strongly connected to the camp. They're also members of the church. The camp director I mentioned before, Chip May, is my head elder. So there's just a lot of connections, mostly informal and relational, but that kind of bind us together. And I mean, we're 3 blocks away, so.
Excellent. So we've talked about a little bit about your family. Tell us a little bit more about what it's like to raise a family there.
Yeah, I mean, so for part of me coming here, I tell people I probably just read too many Wendell Berry books. And for people who aren't familiar with Wendell Berry, he's a farmer and essayist and novelist, poet, and he has, through his fiction, has really painted this community, the Port William community, where it's this place where it's similar to Arcadia in a lot of ways. You've got generational families. You've got also generational disputes. You've got folks who are really relying on one another and embracing life in community in a small town. And like I said, I read a lot of Wendell Berry, and so there was something within me for that I really longed for that for my kids. Having grown up in the suburbs, which has its own blessings and benefits, I really wanted them to be able to have a life that was more deeply connected to creation, where their faith was going to be front and center. Of course, I'm a pastor, so anywhere we live, that's going to be true to a certain extent. But I really wanted that to be able to be cultivated and nurtured, and for them to be able to just enjoy being kids. And I should back up and share one story. As we were considering the call, I was visiting one of the other elders, and his wife took my wife Ann and me out for dinner. And he shared with me some of the challenges, same things I've shared with you. Like, if you want shopping, entertainment, if you want all these kinds of things, Arcadia is probably not for you. But he said, if you value faith and family, creation and community, there's no better place. And that just spoke to me so deeply. And for my family, since we've come here, so we live in a parsonage. We live right next door to the church, literally live in the shadow of the bell tower. And that's just so cool to be able to go back and forth. And I'm speaking to you from my office, which I have my daily commute of 30 seconds. Sometimes I see if I can get back, at noon for lunch, if I can get home before the last of the 12 bells that chime at noon. I usually can. And for my kids, they're able to bike all throughout town. They go down to the lake. They've gotten into fishing. I didn't grow up fishing because, again, I was just a suburban kid. That wasn't something we did. But they've started fishing. They take their BB gun. They go out into the woods and shoot stuff. And they're just all over the place. And of course, we feel safe and comfortable about that. That's not to say, again, that accidents can't happen here, that there aren't bad actors in every place. Of course there are. But just give you one example that kind of underscores this and the difference, I think, in a small town that many others could attest to as well. Neighbors will tell me, hey, I saw your son Sam doing this. Is that okay if he does that? Like there's just eyes around. And the downside of that is sometimes there's that fishbowl sense, right? Especially for the pastor, because people are kind of watching, but you just have to roll with it and embrace it. And I think the upside of it is I get all these other moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas that are keeping an eye on my kids and let me know if they're up to something that they shouldn't be. So it's a neat place to grow up in a lot of ways, and especially so for my kids with those other connections with the family that I mentioned before.
Yeah, that ability to, it sounds like the ability to breathe a little bit as a parent, to not have to constantly stress about where my kids are, that kind of thing, is really
Yeah, for sure.
really good.
Yeah, I think my wife and I, we fashion ourselves kind of free range parents in, in a lot of ways. Where we're like, hey, you guys go out, run around, and an added benefit of having the bell tower here, and other local families attest to it as well, is we just tell the kids, all right, 6 o'clock bell, you better get home. And at 6 o'clock, the carillon plays a couple of hymns, so it goes for about 5 or 7 minutes. So we're like, you need to be home before that's over, okay? So it gives them that sense of, even for the younger ones that can't tell time, that they hear that, and you can hear it from all over town, right? So if they're out playing in the woods, if they're down by the waterside or wherever, they hear that, they know it's time to come home. And yeah, it gives us that sense of, as you say, we're able to breathe. Of course, just being out in the country, that's true as well. Just that sense of you're not being crammed in. And during this season of quarantine, I've talked with friends downstate in the city and so forth, what life is like. And it's tough. But to be honest, I feel a little guilty saying it, Nicholas. Like, during this quarantine, it hasn't been a huge shift for our family. We homeschool, we're continuing to homeschool, and we're getting outside and enjoying creation. And so I feel very fortunate in this season of sheltering in place that we're still able to get outside and keep our sanity.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we should mention for our listeners that we're recording this on the 5th of May. And hopefully by the time you hear this, dear listener, things will have changed. But at least at
Right,
the moment, a lot of states are still in the, whatever you want to call it, lockdown, house arrest, uh,
right.
enforced imprisonment, whatever you want to call it. Uh, let's talk a little bit about that just briefly, since this is a rather unique moment in history. What's I've heard a lot of different things about what's going on in Michigan. What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Governor Whitmer definitely took strong and decisive action early on, to have sheltering in place and to tell folks, okay, you need to stay home. And it's really stretched further and further. And I won't get into the political aspects of it. Your listeners can read up on that. But to be sure, it has been, she made some really strong restrictions on travel, even to the point where, you can't even go over to a friend's house, this sort of thing. And so our congregation, like the vast majority of congregations in Michigan, stopped gathering for gathered worship. And it's changed the way that we go about things. But by the same token, we've still been able to do some things. We have a prayer walk through the woods in town that we encourage people to go on, the way of the cross, we call it. With the church bells, it gives us that sense of still being connected to the congregation, the life of the church, even when we're not able to gather together. And just as far as Michigan more generally, yeah, I think it's been really tough. Michigan's economy has been hit really hard. It's still very manufacturing centered, and even, we're very agricultural up here. But the supply chain is kind of all messed up now, because a lot of food, it doesn't just go to grocery stores, it also goes to universities, to dormitories. And so agriculture is hit. It's just being felt all over the place. So yeah, it's been a challenge, to be sure, and it's felt here even as it's felt in the cities too.
I see. Okay, so let's transition to hidden gems or not so hidden gems in the area. If somebody is coming to Arcadia, let's say that they're coming to Camp Arcadia for the summer, what kind of things in the area would you recommend that they definitely see?
Yeah, so I mean, it definitely begins and ends with recreational opportunities, being out in creation. And if that's not your thing, you're not going to be able to enjoy the fullness of Arcadia. Like, you can still just sit on the beach and be in front of the lake, and that's great, actually. That's not to be denied. And I will say too, having lived on the ocean, on the Monterey Peninsula, it's beautiful to look at. Not a lot of fun to go out and swim in, right? It's very cold, pretty much year round, and it's also salt water, and everything that comes along with that. So we call Lake Michigan the third coast, or it's unsalted living here. And so especially in the summertime, not quite yet as we're talking, but certainly come June, July, August into September, Lake Michigan is great for swimming in. It's very sandy beaches, and it's really wonderful in that respect. The water's very clear. In fact, when we were coming out first moving out here, one of our friends from Washington State saw a picture of Arcadia and of the coastline, and she says, I thought you were moving to Michigan. That looks like the Caribbean. And I said, yeah, we call it the Caribbean of the Midwest. It's Lake Michigan. So, getting out into the lake, going swimming. A lot of people have boats up here, those sorts of things, ski-doos, all of that. I've taken to kayaking. And so, you kayak out in Lake Michigan, but our rivers as well. So the Betsy River is close by. It's just a real nice flowing river. It's great for kayaking. We've got a world-class single-track mountain bike trail here, the St. Pierre Trail, the Arcadia Dunes. So we're surrounded by a lot of conservancy lands, the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy, and there's just these fantastic trails. And if people know anything about this part of Michigan, they probably have heard of the Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes, and Josh talked about this as well, and the Arcadia Dunes, where you just have these monumental, hundreds of feet up, these sand dunes, and it's great to look at. It's fun going down, not as fun going up. It's a pretty serious workout. But
two steps forward and one step back kind of thing.
For sure, yeah. But just the hiking is incredible. The biking, kayaking, all of those sorts of things. In the wintertime, close by here, we have Crystal Mountain. Of course, for folks from out west, they hear mountain and they just kind of chuckle to themselves, and it's true. It's not a mountain certainly not by Colorado or even Washington standards, but it's still good skiing, cross-country skiing trails, all of those sorts of things. And then for other kinds of sports and recreation, we've got Arcadia Bluffs here. So you've got Camp Arcadia, kind of this world-class family camp, and then you've got Arcadia Bluffs, which is a top 100 public course in America, and just a fantastic golf course. It was designed after and very reminiscent of kind of like your Scottish Highlands courses, these sweeping rolling hills, and it's just it's beautiful. You can also, if you're up here in the summertime, go over to Arcadia Bluffs, even if you're not a golfer, and at sunset, you can go get a cocktail and sit out on the back porch of the clubhouse. And each night they've got a what's the the Scottish instrument? Bagpipe. Oh my goodness. They've got a bagpiper out there each night as the sun sets. Sit, look at the lake, have a drink. It's quite an experience.
That sounds sublime.
Yeah, and if you want to go out a little bit further, Michigan, like Washington, we've got a lot of microbreweries, and so there's several small breweries around. There's also a really cool distillery. It's the only farm to table distillery in Michigan called Ironfish. They have great whiskey. And then you go up into the Traverse City area, and you got all your cherry-related things, and especially Cherry Republic, where they have so many samples. You'll walk out of there having gained 5 pounds. So yeah, there's a ton to do, especially recreationally, but it's just a fun place to be.
Yeah, thank you for pointing our listeners to all those cool things that they can do. So now, as we start closing out the podcast, I want to be sure to give you the opportunity to point our listeners towards what you would like, your church website, places to follow you online. Where would you like to point our listeners?
Yeah, thanks very much. So we have a pretty active Facebook presence, facebook.com/Trinity Arcadia. That's the first place I would point them to. We have a pretty static website, but also to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We only really started it up with everything that's been going on with the coronavirus, but we're posting videos there in addition to our services. I'm doing just a brief little devotional podcast I call the Daily Psalmanac, where I hope to help people grow in the practice of prayer by deepening their relationship with the Psalms, so taking a psalm and reflecting on it. And then finally, I would point out our podcast I do with my friend Chip May from camp. We call Campfire Conversations, where we're able to have in-depth interviews with the deans and lecturers at camp and other friends, and that's been really good as well. So, and they can feel free to befriend me on Facebook as well, Ryan Tinetti.
Okay, good deal. We'll have links to all that good stuff at lutherancartographer.com/25. So listeners, if you'd like to go there for links to all that good stuff, please go there to the show notes. Pastor Tinetti, thanks for coming on the show. What are your parting thoughts for our listeners?
I think the big thing for me and for any of us is, even though we're pilgrims and we're making our way toward the new creation, to find a way to be rooted in your place. And it's been a journey for me, and I'm grateful to have found Arcadia and to be here. But wherever you are, to make it a home and to be there in the place that God has put you, and to be grateful for it, and to never stop that longing for the kingdom yet to come.
Amen. Thank you again for your time today. God's peace.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Lutheran Cartographer. For more about the things that we talked about today, check out the show notes page at lutherancartographer.com/25. I encourage you to check out that Audible offer so you can get that free audiobook that you get to keep. That's at audibletrial.com/lutherancartographer. I encourage you to subscribe to the show on Stitcher or on iTunes so that you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I would appreciate it if you would leave a rating and a review so that other people will see this podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Nicholas Weber. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.